It's my distinct pleasure to summarize the rich discussion from our breakout session on the current state of global governance. Before I begin, I'd like to add thanks that many have already expressed to Thierry de Montbrial and his colleagues for organizing the Fourth World Policy Conference, and more generally pay my respects to his vision and his Herculean effort to organize this with his colleagues, because I know that it's an enormous undertaking, and we're all very grateful. The topic of our session was, in a sense, the topic of this entire conference, an examination of how the world is coming together to adapt, and in some cases not to adapt, to growing political, security, economic, ecological, and indeed moral interdependence. We looked at how institutions were attempting to respond, and sometimes failing to respond, to new global challenges that transcend national boundaries, how they were responding to the rise of non-state actors, both benevolent and malevolent, and in particular, how they were responding to the emergence of new global power centers that were challenging the Western liberal order that has dominated the world since 1945. Four major themes emerged from these deliberations. The first was the sheer complexity of the global agenda, which was straining the capacity of existing international institutions in profound ways. Most international institutions were created, it was stated several times, for a very different world, to deal with Westphalian problems, whereas now the major focus of world politics has shifted from the management of great power relations, although that remains very important, to the management of mutual vulnerabilities and risks, from financial instability to global warming to terrorism to weapons of mass destruction, proliferation, to resource scarcity, infectious disease, transnational crime, to name just a few. The object of global governance is to permit states, and increasingly states in collaboration with private sector actors and members of civil society, to address problems that transcend sovereign boundaries and to manage competition amongst themselves, in addition to providing global public goods and mitigating global bads. This challenge, it was stated, is partly a cognitive one. The sheer complexity of global interdependence has outpaced our ability to see connections among multiple domains. We continue to take stovepiped institutional responses to what are really multidisciplinary problems. Our typical response has been to simply add to the proliferation of international agreements. One commentator noted that there are, the Swedish Academy of Sciences had estimated that there are 158,000 international agreements and other instruments to manage global problems. And the vast majority of these obviously have been created since 1945. Are we even aware of what these agreements are? Are we even aware of how these agreements relate to one another? We also live in a world in which the former verities that we had taken for granted have collapsed, or at least have been chastened. Consider the neoliberal consensus that dominated much of the post-Cold War era. This was by some measures hugely successful, lifting perhaps a billion and a half, perhaps 2 billion people out of poverty. But it also unleashed a level of connectivity that is beyond our ability to comprehend or even control. In the aftermath of the global financial crisis, we have seen a real sense that the Western liberal paradigm is under challenge. And the global financial crisis may simply be the tip of the iceberg as we approach planetary limits, including the possibility of catastrophic climate change. This led some in our group to question whether or not we need to ramp back our loyalty to hyper-globalization and make it more manageable, since our core institutions are failing so manifestly. The second major point was that global institutional reform has lagged very badly behind changing realities. In the wake of the global financial crisis, of course, there have been some major institutional innovations. The most important of these is the creation of the G20 as the premier forum for global economic coordination. Additional steps include the creation of the Financial Stability Board, the reinvigoration of the IMF, and some modest and still incremental shifts in the shares modifications of the international financial institutions, although they continue to lag behind global power trends. But even in this arena of global governance, we see limitations, and the G20 was a case in point mentioned. On one level, this is the most profound change in global economic governance. It's the only forum in which the leaders of the established and emerging powers meet exclusively in a situation of formal equality. And yet, the ambitions that this body transform from an emergency crisis committee to a more formal global steering group have not been fulfilled since the what would be seen as the zenith of the G20's activities in the April 2009 London summit. The lesson would seem to be that in the absence of a major crisis and the solidarity of the lifeboat, narrower national interests and preferences will continue to block progress on global governance reform. Moreover, if we look generally, more broadly at different aspects of international activity, we find entire global arenas where international institutional reform has been blocked. The most fundamental blockage continues to be reform of the UN Security Council, whose permanent membership has not changed since 1945. While the Council is not yet in fundamental crisis, there is a general sense that the current glide path is not indefinitely sustainable and that a legitimacy crisis is inevitable. Beyond the Security Council, participants noted entire other arenas in which institutions were either failing or lacking entirely. With respect to the global environment, beyond climate change, there was a question as to whether or not the fragmented system for managing global environmental affairs calls for the creation, finally, of a World Environmental Organization. Mention was also made of the fact that migration, international migration, which is obviously very high on the international agenda, lacks an institutional home. Similarly with crime, which is perhaps one of the biggest beneficiaries of globalization has been transnational organized crime, and yet the institutions we possess, like UNODC in this very city, are hurting and not particularly well resourced. Energy, mention was made of the obsolescence of the IEA, given the fact that it is restricted to OECD countries. And then when it came to trade, there was dissatisfaction with the fact that the WTO had not completed or even made much progress at all on the Doha development round. And as a result, we had a situation where it was being replaced in many practical ways by bilateral, plurilateral, and regional initiatives. A third big point out of the four that I'm going to mention is that the nature of multilateral cooperation is changing. The participants noted that there had been great dissatisfaction with the blockage of international institutions, including the United Nations, and this is encouraging greater reliance on both regional and sub-regional organizations, and also on more informal ad hoc arrangements for specific issues, as well as flexible consultative forums. The result is that we live in a world of multilateralism that transcends the UN-centered world order that some still equate with multilateralism. Such a world brings flexibility, and that brings advantages, but there are questions about how multilateralism à la carte relates to multilateralism à la charte, that is the Charter of the United Nations. The search for international treaties to solve complex global problems, we also believed may be a fool's errand. Climate change may be the archetypal example. We have the UNFCCC and its annual COP meetings, but the notion that one forum could provide possibly a comprehensive solution seems illusory. Progress on global issues will increasingly take the form of less binding agreements and more parallel national actions, ideally with some degree of monitoring. In general, this world of multilateralism calls for increased policy coherence amongst actors. One of the most pressing imperatives within the world of global economic governance is some form of more clearly linking the informal steering committee function of the G20 on the one hand, which takes the agenda, takes the initiative in setting the agenda, with more formal organizations like the IMF and the World Bank, which will implement those decisions, as well as ramping up some of the economic coordination functions of the United Nations with a very reformed ECOSOC. The fourth and final big point that I want to make is that integrating emerging powers into reformed international institutions of global governance will not be easy. In its fantasies, the West would imagine socializing China, India, Brazil, Turkey, and other emerging powers as responsible stakeholders who would enjoy greater weight and voice in world bodies in return for embracing existing norms and for shouldering greater burdens of providing global public goods. In practice, this faces several obstacles. To begin with, and this is a point that Thierry began with, established and emerging powers often diverge in fundamental values and do not agree on the content of norms, of global norms, whether these are the appropriate boundaries of national sovereignty, the balance between the state and the market, or the foundations of domestic political legitimacy. They want to be rule makers, not simply rule takers. In addition, rising powers are often more inclined to enjoy the status and benefits of entree into global institutions than to contribute to global public goods, and their status as developing countries reinforces this tendency. Existing institutions are also notoriously resistant to accommodating rising powers, given the vested interest of existing power wielders, and in addition, the difficulty of balancing, when you're trying to expand a group, the three objectives of efficiency, legitimacy, and like-mindedness. Two more points. Effective global governance is increasingly constrained by domestic governance, including volatile domestic politics and sovereignty concerns. Democracy, far from being a panacea, can actually complicate international agreement on an increasingly intrusive and complex global agenda, whether one is speaking of trade rules or verification principles of non-proliferation regimes, since leaders must balance the political needs at home with the requirements of effective multilateral cooperation. And the final point is that it is not clear where the motor of global governance reform will come from. Established powers, notably the United States, Europe, and Japan, are increasingly inward-looking and going to be experiencing retrenchment. Special mention has to be made about the political gridlock and, in some ways, irresponsibility of the United States political system at this current juncture. But China and others are not ready to lead either. In principle, we need to move forward towards a more collective form of global leadership or some form of concert, but it was unclear that this is possible in the current constellation of interests that we see in the world today. Thank you.